In this section, we're going to talk about reviewing the factoring of polynomials. Remember, the first step in factoring is to always factor out the greatest common factor. If we have two terms, we want to first say, look at the numbers. What do 4 and 8 have in common? Those both have a 4 in common. Now look at the letters. The first one has an x squared, the second one has an x, so what they both have in common is just a single x. For the y terms, the first one has 3 y's, the second one has 4 y's, so they have 3 y's in common. We need to then multiply our common factor times another monomial to give us the individual factors we started with. Notice we already have the 4. We need another x in order to make x squared. We already have the y to the third. So 4xy cubed times x will give me 4x squared y to the third. Looking at our second term, we already have a 4, so we're going to need a positive 2 to get the positive 8. We already have the x's. The common factor is y cubed, and we need a y to the fourth, so we're going to have to put a y. Looking at that with one more example, first of all, look at your numbers. A 16, a 2, and a negative 8 all have a 2 in common. They also each have an x. We can say at most they all have 1x because this last term only has 1. If we multiply that times another number to get the first factor, 2 times 8 will give us 16. We have x, we need x to the fourth, which means we're going to need to put x to the third. Then we have plus. We already have the 2 there, and we have 1x. In order to get an x squared, we're going to need to multiply by another x. 2 times what will give us negative 8? We say that that's going to be a negative 4, and we already have the x. So if we multiply this back out, 2x times 8x cubed will give me 16x to the fourth. 2x times x will give me a positive 2x squared, and 2x times a negative 4 will give me an 8x. You need to always make sure that you're going to end up with the first thing that you started with. The next kind of factoring we're going to look at is going to be the difference of perfect squares. Remember, the pattern is going to be if you have a squared minus b squared, it's always going to factor into a minus b times a plus b. So let's say that we have x squared minus 9. We have a perfect square for the x squareds, and we have a perfect square for the 9. So the a would actually be x, and the b would actually be 3. This is going to factor into x plus 3 times x minus 3. If we look at something like 16 y to the fourth minus 25, again we have perfect squares here, because in order to get 16y to the fourth, we can say that's 4y to the second raised to the second power. The 25, the perfect square, is going to be 5 squared, so this is going to go into 4y plus 5 and 4y minus 5. Now remember, this only goes for the difference of two perfect squares. If we have something like a squared plus b squared, you cannot factor this. It's only when that middle sign is going to be a subtraction sign or the difference of two perfect squares. One last example, if we look at x squared minus 81, that's going to factor because we have a perfect square for x, we have a perfect square for 81, will be into x plus 9 and x minus 9. Now, this is going to lead us into the trinomials. When we have 3 terms, you're going to try to break that down into 2 different parentheses. The lead coefficient in all of these problems is going to be 1. So we're going to say what times what will multiply to give us x squared. And we'll say x times x. Notice that we are going to multiply to get a positive 28, and we're going to add to get a positive 11x. So we want to say what 2 numbers will multiply for 28, yet add for 11. And that's going to be a positive 7 and a positive 4. After you factor, I want you to mentally FOIL back out. X times x is x squared. Outers is going to be a positive 4x. Inners is going to be a positive 7x, which combines for that positive 11x. And last terms, 4 times 7 will be a positive 28. Always good to mentally check your answers once you've factored. Again, if we're looking at another example, x squared minus 10x plus 16, we're going to try to break that into two different binomials. We know the first terms will be x times x to give us x squared. This time we're going to multiply to get a positive, and we're going to add to get a negative. That means that both of these signs will have to be negative, because a negative times a negative will give us that positive, and a negative plus a negative will give us a negative. And you want to think of the factors of 16. What two numbers will multiply to give us 16, yet add to give us negative 10? And you'll notice that this will have to be a negative 2 and a negative 8. One more before we go on. If we have x squared plus 5x plus 6, we know that we're going to try to break it into two binomials, and we'll have x times x to give us the x squared. Now this time, if we're going to multiply to get a negative, one of your signs has to be positive and one of your signs has to be negative. So we need to think about the factors of negative 6. We can have 1 and negative 6, or negative 1 and positive 6. We can have 2 and negative 3, or negative 2 and positive 3. You want to think about adding these together. Well, 1 plus negative 6 will give us negative 5. We want to get a positive 5. Negative 1 plus 6 will give us a positive 5. So negative 1 and positive 6 must be the numbers that go in there. It's going to be x minus 1 and x plus 6. You can factor by grouping the first two terms together, or grouping the last two terms together. If you group these first two terms together and pull out the greatest common factor, notice that both of those terms have an x. If we pull an x out of those two terms, that's going to leave us with an x plus 7. The last two terms, notice that those have a positive 8 in common. So if we factor out a positive 8, we'll have x plus 7 as our second parentheses also. Now the trick to factoring by grouping is to have a common parentheses. Think of a star plus b star. What do they have in common? They have a star in common. So if you pull the star out, you're going to be left with a plus b. We're doing the same thing here, except for we have a times a parentheses plus b times a parentheses. So we want to pull the common term of the parentheses out and be left with the a plus b. Notice the x plus 7 matches, so we can take the x plus 7, pull it out, and that's going to leave us with the x plus the 8. One more time by grouping, look at 10x squared minus 15x. Notice that both of those terms have a 5 in common, and they also have an x. If we pull out a 5x, what's going to be left is 2x, because 5x times 2x is 10x squared, and 5x times negative 3 is going to give me a negative 15x. Looking at the last two terms, what do positive 6x minus 9 have in common? And you're going to say that those have a positive 3 in common. If we pull out a positive 3, 3 times 2x will give me the 6x, and 3 times minus 3 will give us a negative 9. Now factoring by grouping only works if these two parentheses match. Since they match, we're going to pull out the common factor of 2x minus 3, and we'll be left with 5x plus 3. That's going to help us factor when our lead coefficient is not 1. When our lead coefficient is not 1, we're going to use what we call the AC method. The a is going to be the coefficient of the x squared, and the c is going to be the negative 12. Multiply these two numbers together. 6 times negative 12 is going to give us negative 72. At this point, you want to think about the factors of negative 72 that will add to give us the negative 1. So let's list out the factors. We can have 1 and 72, One of those could be negative, the other one could be positive, or one of those could be positive and the other one could be negative. Regardless, when we add those two numbers together, we do not get the negative 1 that we need. We can have 2 times 36. Well, even if we thought of one of them as a positive and one of them as a negative, there's no way we can combine a 2 and a 36 to get a 1. We can have 3, and 3 would be times 24. Again, we can have a negative and a positive, or a positive and a negative that will not add together to give us 1. You want to look at 4. 4 will go into 72 18 times. If we have one of them a positive and one of them a negative, again, no way we're going to get the 1 that we need. 5 will not work. 6 will work, though. 6 times 12 is going to give us 72. If we take a positive 6 and a negative 12 and add those together, that's not going to work, or a negative 6 and a positive 12. But you can also look at the factors 8 and 9. If we take a positive 8 added to a negative 9, we're going to get the negative 1 we want here. So if we will rewrite this middle term of negative 1x, keeping the 6x and the negative 12, as a positive 8x minus a 9x, then we can factor by grouping. Looking at these first two terms, what do they have in common? Well, they both have a 2, and they both have an x, and that's going to leave me with 3x plus 4. And looking at these last two terms, notice that they have a 3 in common, but more importantly, they have a negative 3 in common, because we want our parentheses to be able to match in order to do grouping. So negative 3 times positive 3x will give me a negative 9x, and negative 3 times a positive 4 will give me the negative 12. At this point, we have the two parentheses matching, so we can pull out the 3x plus 4, and we'll be left with 2x minus 3. This AC method will really come in handy if your coefficient of your trinomial is not 1. Let's try one more. The AC method. The A is 5 and the C is negative 8. So you want to take the 5 times the negative 8. That gives us negative 40. And you want to think of the factors of negative 40 that will add to give us negative 39 in the middle. Well, if we take a negative 1 times a positive 40 and add them together, that's going to give us a positive 39. Right number, but wrong sign. So if we take a positive 1 and negative 40, that's going to add together to give us the negative 39. That's what we need to replace the middle term with. Keeping the 5x squared, keeping the negative 8, replacing the negative 39x with a positive 1x and a minus 40x, and then factor by grouping. The first two terms have an x in common, leaving me with a 5x plus 1. The second two terms have a negative 8 in common. If we factor out a negative 8, we will also be left with 5x plus 1. Here again, we'll see that we have a common factor in the parentheses of the 5x plus 1, so we can factor the 5x plus 1 out, leaving us with just x minus 8. I hope this review has helped you.